So last week we started our first unit on rhetorical analysis, and we discussed what a rhetorical analysis is, its purpose. We talked about the rhetorical situation, and we talked about rhetorical techniques. And this week we are going to talk about rhetorical appeals. And just to kind of recap, a rhetorical analysis is not looking at a text to see whether or not you agree with what the author is saying. A rhetorical analysis is, in fact, looking at how effective a text is based on how it's presented. Rhetorical strategies or rhetorical techniques are how the author conveys his or her message. And we talked about exemplification or example, comparison, contrast, cause and effect, narration, definition, classification, division, figurative language, all of those types of strategies that an author uses in order to kind of put together his or her message. So, if a rhetorical analysis is asking you whether, or if it's answering the question of whether or not an argument is effective, if the author makes the point, the goal is met, the message is put across, and strategies are what make an author persuasive or effective, then it really asks us to look at strategies and how they create a persuasive appeal. Make sense? If not, hang tight and hopefully I will unmurky the waters. So, there are three major appeals that we classically kind of think of when we think of persuasion and when we think of argument. And Aristotle, that really old dude who was really concerned with rhetoric and the effective use of language, right? He defines those appeals as logos, ethos, and pathos. And I know that those are not unfamiliar terms for you guys. You've all heard of logos, ethos, and pathos before because they make up what we call the rhetorical triangle. And if you think of the rhetorical situation as a rhetorical triangle, a little Dorito of love, if you will. The rhetorical triangle really establishes that all forms of communication, all types of texts, because remember, all writing is a form of communication or a form of conversation. And it really takes place, this conversation takes place between the text or the message, the audience, and the author. You have to have all three of those things in order for communication to happen. And if we, each of our elements in the rhetorical triangle is associated with logos, ethos, and pathos. So they are all inextricably linked together. And in order to be effective or be persuasive, an author uses strategies to create those a logos appeal, an ethos appeal, and a pathos appeal. So if we break down my triangle a little bit further, let's look at logos. And I mentioned logos first because it is associated with the message or the purpose. It basically means that our author is appealing to our logic, our thought process. It refers to the clarity of a claim, its logic, and its supporting evidence. Because if you don't have logic in your argument, if you don't have logic in your writing, it doesn't matter how how you use those other appeals, none of it's going to work. So logic is really what you want to think of when you frame um, or when you're analyzing a text first and foremost, because if the claim is not clear, if the claim is not logical, it cannot be effective. Um, if we think of logos as this appeal to logic, asking us to use our mind, using our head, it really depends. I mean, what appeals to our logic? Things like facts, statistics, authoritative quotes, that that establishment of authority and knowledge base and all that kind of stuff, that really makes us think with our heads. So, and things like facts, statistics, and authoritative quotes are used as evidence to support an argument and therefore persuade an audience. Um, Logos is also associated with reasons for accepting the message, the claim, the argument. So, what reasons the author has? So, it shows a logical relationship between ideas and some common strategies that are used to establish kind of this logical appeal, the appeal to our logic, are comparison, contrast, cause and effect, definition, and analogy. So if you look at something like our text from last week, why America is self-segregating. Dana Boyd does a really good job laying out facts and statistics with her examples, right? She also does a really good job appealing to our logic with her comparison and contrast of how, for example, college campuses used to be versus how they are now. How they used to be this place of diversity, and how now they are more segregated. She does a really good job appealing to our logic and establishing her claim and her making her argument that we are more self-segregated because she shows this cause and effect relationship between the introduction of technology and the more segregated we've become because of things like Facebook or Netflix or various other technological advancements. So through those various strategies, she is appealing to our logic. So we can see the connection between those ideas. Pathos, and it's the Greek word for suffering or experience. And pathos is often thought of as the emotional appeal. Cue the music for those Sarah McLachlan ASPCA commercials, right? That you want to change the channel because you hate to see all those poor puppies and kitties suffering because of them being abused. But the overall purpose of those commercials or those messages is to get us to donate money. And they do that by appealing most often to our emotions. And really, pathos is all not necessarily like the appeal to like, oh, it makes me happy, it makes me sad. It's more than that. A pathetic appeal or appealing to our pathos is getting the audience to be open to the argument by drawing on emotions and interests, imagination, a sense of identity. It's asking us to relate to the author or the narrative or the message in some way that we can connect to it personally, not just with our logic, but with our we want to have a vested emotional interest or personal interest. And pathos is where the appeal to pathos is really getting us, it encourages us to identify with the author or identify with the message. It helps us, an emotional appeal establishes a connection. And how the author makes a reader see his or her Ooh, that's a typo. Beliefs, values, and understanding. Um, and most common strategies associated with those that pathetic appeal, the appeal to our emotions, that appeal to our heart, that appeal to our sense of identity, are diction or emotionally loaded words, anecdotes or narrative. Because if we can connect to a story, we can connect to the people, either first person narrative or third person narratives. If we can connect to a person, we are invested in that narrative. We are invested in that message. Sensory details or figurative language, and description. And remember, there are two types of description: evocative and oh my gosh, I can't think of the one. Informative, informative description. But if we are playing on our emotions versus our logic, then it would usually be evocative rather than informative. So if we look at something like someone like Dana Boyd's argument when she is talking about her example of Netflix. And I think that on a personal level, we can see ourselves as someone that we can identify with that, and we can relate to that example because it's something that we see firsthand. And we can also see in ourselves, well, hey, maybe I am uh, unintentionally separating myself or segregating myself from new kind of diverse experiences. And the same for Facebook. So moving on to ethos. Ethos is the Greek word for character, and it is most commonly associated with the author, the person writing the text. And when we think of ethos, I mean, what does the word look like? It looks like ethics, right? And it it does in some way have to do with kind of an ethical appeal in that this kind of idea of right and wrong, but it goes beyond that, and it looks more at the character or the image of the author versus the appeal to our personal views of right and wrong. Because if we're looking at our personal views of right and wrong, that would be more of a pathetic appeal. But it's the character of the author, the image of the writer. How does the author inspire trust? What credentials does the author give us through that text, and how? Um, Reputation, knowledge of the subject. How honest do we believe them to be? Are they fair-minded in that they present kind of both sides of an argument, if there is such a thing, that if it's relevant to that particular message? And I want to draw your attention to kind of how Dana Boyd does that through her various rhetorical strategies. She gives a first person narrative establishing her credentials, her knowledge of the subject, by talking about, through her first person narrative, when she's talking about her experience, her personal experience on college campuses. So sometimes narrative is a way for an author to establish his or her credibility, for him or her to show the kind of trustworthiness of that individual. Knowledge of the subject, well, using examples, facts, statistics, the same things that an author does to appeal to our logic can also help establish the character or the image of the author. So you'll notice that a lot of these strategies overlap with their appeals. They do more than one thing. Every strategy can appeal to more than one side of that rhetorical pyramid. There are two types of ethos, inartistic and artistic. And inartistic is exactly what it sounds like. It's not created, essentially, in terms of the author doesn't really create that image. It pre-exists. It comes with a station or a position. So if you think about it, look at the office of the president, not the person who's the president, but the office of the president. And traditionally, that is seen as the highest, most respected office that we have in our country. And if a person is indeed elected to be president of the United States, that instills a certain amount of credibility, a certain amount of trust, a certain amount of respect and authority. And we could look at policemen. Same thing. They are supposed, not the people, but the station itself. They are supposed to be people who protect and serve. A teacher, for example, that is a pre-existing kind of I don't want to say a position of authority, but we're supposed to trust our teachers to do what's best for us. We're supposed to trust that they will do, what does a teacher do? It takes care of and educates our children. So my point that I'm trying to make is that if a person has a particular position in whatever capacity, automatically we have those pre-existing ideas about their credibility. However, just because we have this kind of expectation, and inartistic credibility or inartistic ethos can be broken by an individual. So if you look at someone like the president, think about back, you guys might be too young to think about President Bill Clinton and his kind of administration during the 90s. But if I say Bill Clinton nowadays, who do you typically associate with Bill Clinton? Well, Monica Lewinsky, right? And that whole incident with Monica Lewinsky in some ways breaks his credibility, because he's impeached over not whether or not he had a relationship with that woman or not. I mean, that people have affairs and people do that kind of thing all the time. Not saying that that's good or bad. I mean, having an affair can kind of weaken his credibility. But the fact that he lied under oath, something that a president and indeed a lawyer, someone like, because he was a lawyer before he was president, or a politician, that you cannot do. So through a person's actions, they can break that kind of credibility. If you look at, I'll stop here in just a second, but if you look at the position of a teacher, and that pre-existing kind of concept of or credibility that a teacher has, that too can be broken if we, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, but I'm going to use this as an example, Mary Kay Lorento. And if you don't know who she is, you should totally Google her, because it's a fascinating story. But she goes to jail She was like an eighth grade, a sixth grade teacher. A sixth grade teacher. She goes to jail and is convicted of child abuse because she has a relationship with a student. I believe he was 13 at the time, and becomes pregnant by her said student. And she goes to jail. She loses her job. She loses her reputation. She loses all credibility. And fascinating as it is, she gets out of jail and then she resumes her kind of relationship with the student and goes to jail again and has another child by him, and ironically enough they are still together to this day. So it's very weird, but my point is that just because your position or your that inartistic ethos, just because you have it one time doesn't mean that you can't lose it. The other type of ethos is artistic. And that is the image the author creates for himself or herself, that persona, that view of the author that he or she creates through various strategies. We'll talk more about that when we do our activity for the week later on. I'm pre-recording this, so I don't know when it's going to be, but we will talk about that artistic persona that is created and how it establishes a form of credibility and things like that. So in a nutshell, I'm almost done. In a nutshell, how does this all come together? Because I don't want you to confuse strategies with the appeal, because strategies are what the author uses to appeal to our logic, our emotions, or our sense of ethos, right? That's how an author creates those appeals. And these strategies are what makes an author effective or persuasive or not. So they are all kind of tied together, but it's really the strategies that we're looking at and how they create that persuasive appeal and make a message effective. So I look forward to our activity later on this week, and I've asked you all to read an article in your text called "Why Rural America Voted for Trump." And I chose this not because of any political agenda on my own part, but it is President Trump's presidency has been controversial and polarizing from the very beginning. And it is a great article to use because it forces us to look objectively at the message and not the topic, which is what rhetorical analysis is all about. So I look forward to our activity later on this week, and I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say and any questions you may have in terms of rhetorical analysis, rhetorical situation, rhetorical strategies, or rhetorical appeals. So I will leave you here, and I will see you soon.